The story begins before World War II, but as a little background, we're going to be dealing with a government activity that until recently has been secret. This is signals intelligence. Signals intelligence is sometimes called cryptologic intelligence, and it has two aspects. One of the founders of our profession liked to say that it was two sides of the same coin. In one side, we protect our communications from foreign eavesdroppers and those who would wish us harm. And on the other side, we seek to penetrate the communications of our country's adversaries. Signals intelligence is a process. It involves the eavesdropping or collection, as we call it, or intercept of enemy communications. Generally, the communications that the government is interested in are encrypted with some kind of code or cipher. So the process begins with collection or intercept, continues through cryptanalysis, or as is commonly called, code breaking. Then if the government is successful at solving the foreign adversaries' codes, chances are the underlying language will not be in English, so the message must be translated. Often messages are a little bit elliptical, and they need analysis. They need comparing with other messages or comparing with things that are known from other sources of information. The government has generally not done this. It surprises many people given the emphasis on foreign intelligence in our own time, but the American government has, until World War II, had really only done signals intelligence in wartime. And even in peacetime, other forms of intelligence were not very robust. But in wartime, things are necessary that the government would not consider in times of peace. In the 1930s, the US Army and Navy each had a very small but highly professional organization to do cryptanalysis or code breaking. It included on one end the intercept operators, and on the other end the translators and analysts. This small beginning really grew during World War II. Both the Army and the Navy expanded their code-breaking organizations to about 10,000 people each. And of that large number, more than half in both services were women. Because men were being drafted for combat duty, the government was hard-pressed to find workers, and they realized there was an untapped source. There were many women with advanced degrees, with either college degrees or graduate degrees, often in mathematics or foreign languages. So both services drafted, or I should not say drafted, it was not like the men, but they recruited thousands of women, about 5,000 women in the Navy and about 7,000 women in the Army. They gave these ladies minimal training and turned them loose against enemy communications. The so-called code girls developed their own techniques as well as the existing official ones, and they did a very thorough job of exploiting enemy communications for intelligence purposes. I should say that the intelligence, once it was produced, was marked top secret, and it was marked top secret ultra. Ultra meant this came from signals intelligence, or SIGINT. And it alerted readers that the information was extremely sensitive, and it should not be shared with anybody who was not cleared for that level of information. Arlington Hall Station played a major role in this effort during World War II and then after. Now, the Army's cryptologic organization, it was known as the Signal Intelligence Service, had some success, particularly against Japanese diplomatic communications. It was small but highly professional. It's hard to realize that in the 1930s, this kind of intelligence for a major power was staffed by only enough people to fit comfortably around a dinner table. But they were expert mathematicians with specialties in statistics and statistical analysis, and they did very highly skilled and sensitive work. In the center of this photograph, the person in the dark suit, as he was at the center of our cryptologic effort, was William Friedman. He'd been experienced in government code making and code breaking for several decades since World War I. By profession, he was a scientist, and he was one of the first in the world to realize that the basis for modern codes and cipher work was mathematics. So he hired mathematicians and some linguists as his organization began to expand in the late 1930s. Originally, the organization was located in Army headquarters in what was known as the Munitions Building down on the Mall in Washington. It's approximately where the Vietnam Memorial is today. Place was small, was crowded, was not desirable for work by more than a few people, just because of space considerations. Well, as the group expanded over the 1930s and began to get really large at the end of the 1930s, something had to be done. Well, the Army had a station in Northern Virginia near Warrenton in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where they had their intercept operators. This is the location where people would be listening and copying down foreign communications, particularly German, but a few other countries as well. And staff from Friedman's organization made regular car trips between the munitions building on the Mall in Washington and Warrenton, Virginia. One of these, or most of these trips, went along Arlington Boulevard, which we all know and love today. At some point, as they were traveling this road, they found a large property that seemed to be underutilized. This was a girls' school for elite children, Arlington Hall. With a little investigation, it was found that the school was not prosperous, needed money. So, as it did with many other facilities throughout the war, the government negotiated a sale to acquire the property, in this case, to acquire it for the Army's cryptologic effort. The magnificent building in front, the old Southern mansion with the great pillars and windows, and must have been an attraction. And in fact, the Army used the mansion is part of its advertising when it recruited all these women to come and work in cryptology during the war. I should digress here for a moment. These are the senior people in the Army's organization. Arlington Hall Station itself and the Signal Intelligence Service was run by General Preston Quarterman, a Signal Corps officer in the Army. But it was largely civilian in orientation. William Friedman remained a civilian. The people he had hired before the war that we saw in the other picture were essentially civilians at heart, although in wartime they had reserve military commissions and they became mid-level officers. The mansion and its grounds were great advertising, but they somewhat masked the actual workspaces. Once the Army took possession, they built temporary buildings for the actual work. They were hot in the summer, cold in the winter, drafty, still crowded no matter how large they were. But they were designated as temporary. People had to put up with it. Well, temporary is one of the words that's in the ear of the beholder. These temporary buildings were still in existence, I think, up through the 1980s. I remember visiting them myself in the 80s. The personnel, in addition to these original 1930s hires, were thousands and thousands of women, math majors, language majors, some just good analysts who could be taught this. As this picture suggests, there were a smattering of young men in the workforce, but they were mostly people who had been in the profession before the war and were there to try to help the young new employees get acclimated to cryptology based on their pre-war experience. One of the ladies who became a very powerful figure at NSA after World War II recalled her first day. She had been a student in North Carolina. She saw the young men in her university dropping out of school to serve their country in the war emergency. She felt she could do no less. She visited a recruiter and was asked if she would like to come to Washington to do secret work. Well, she did. She passed the aptitude tests rather handily. She came to Arlington Hall on a rainy day, and she noted people packed in like sardines. She said she saw one man with a sun visor sitting at a table, lady with an ice pack on her head, one guy walking around in his underwear, another barefooted. There'd been a rainstorm or something, and some of them had come in taken off their shoes to dry them. She thought, my God, what have I got myself into? And the lady who was showing her around just said very simply, there's a simple explanation for this. This is the German problem, as if that covered all bases. But Juanita quickly acclimated and became a skilled cryptanalyst and a leader of cryptanalysts as well. But another shot that will give you an example of how crowded the facility was. Often they would run shifts around the clock. So even people who had desks only had them for a third of the day. They would get one drawer in the desk for their own storage needs, and the other shifts would get the other drawers. Well, that's the background for Arlington Hall. And if you have general questions about Arlington Hall, its work, or its recruitment, I'll be glad to talk about them. But we want to discuss the question of African Americans in the work during the war. Now, Arlington Hall covered a wide range of topics of interest in the war. The United States and Great Britain cooperated in solving the secret codes of our common enemies during the war. The British concentrated on German communications with some support from the Americans. Arlington Hall did work some German targets. Arlington Hall concentrated on Japanese army messages with some support from the British, who did a little along that line as well. But this was global war, and there were many targets that just were not covered in the available workforce. But of course, targets that were military, that meant the success or failure of American military operations, possibly the lives and deaths of many Americans in uniform, had the priority. Okay. As we all know, society at the time, particularly in the South, was segregated. There were strict laws separating the races, separate facilities for each. And as the war began, the military was very much interested in tapping into the work potential that African Americans represented. But George Marshall, the senior soldier, the chief of staff of the Army, favored keeping African Americans in segregated units, often with white officers. He was not, as far as I know, a racist. In fact, I think we can say he was not a racist based on his experience before the war in working with people from all walks of American life. However, he recognized that if Army units were integrated, there were many Southern young men who would not serve in an unsegregated unit or would not be fully committed. There would be opposition from Congress that could affect the Army's budget and its ability to acquire the materials it needed for war. So George Marshall sanctioned segregated military units. And because of opposition from Congress to anything else, most African Americans were put in non-combat units. Southern congressmen objected to African Americans getting weapons training or getting their hands on weapons. In the midst of all this, in early 1944, out of the hierarchy in the Pentagon came an order to Arlington Hall Station to General Quarterman, the commander of the station and the Signal Intelligence Service, to hire African Americans and give them meaningful work, not just put them in support jobs or heavy labor jobs. Many of the African Americans we interviewed, or at least a fair number of them, thought that this order had originated with Eleanor Roosevelt, the wife of the president. It's true that Eleanor Roosevelt was quite sympathetic to the plight of African Americans at the time. Also true that she intervened with her husband on their behalf. However, there's virtually no incidents where she would intervene on anybody's behalf when it came to military matters. So we do not have any direct information that she prompted her husband to issue such an order. And in the absence of any direct information, we have to believe that she really did not have an effect on this. But it's possible. That's the best I can say about it. At any rate, this order created something of a dilemma at Arlington Hall Station. The commander, Preston Quarterman, of course, in conjunction with the good leadership principles, delegated the job to one of his key subordinates, a staff officer named Earl Cook. Cook was a good SIGINT person. He had managed SIGINT for a number of years, was a good manager. But this order really flummoxed him. He did not know any African Americans personally except one. And I don't know exactly, I don't want to call him a bigot per se, but he had served in a military that had been segregated for his entire career and much longer. So I've got to believe that he was not progressive in his racial attitudes. The only person that he knew who was African American was a man named William Coffey. Coffey had been a janitor at Arlington Hall when it was a girls' school. When the institution became part of the federal government, he asked to stay on in a federal job, and he was given the job of messenger, a courier, taking mail and packages from one office to another. At that time, the only career path open to him was that he could become chief messenger someday. So it was a pretty dismal time, and his future looked uncertain. But Earl Cook had apparently dealt with him in assigning courier chores. So he went to Bill Coffey, and he asked if Coffey knew anybody, any of his friends or neighbors who might be qualified to work at Arlington Hall, and could he spread the word? Well, Coffey did. And as you might imagine, there were, just as there had been with women, many African Americans who had college degrees, but who were shoehorned into menial jobs because of the racist attitudes of the day. And they were eager for a chance to better themselves and to show what they could do. So Bill Coffey brought in quite a number of people, and it was like networking today. A few came in, they spread the word among their friends, and eventually Arlington Hall had an office full of African Americans. Most of them were women, just as with the civilian population that had been hired, the white population that had been hired previously. The African Americans who worked at Arlington Hall lived in rugged conditions. All of Northern Maryland, Washington, D.C., and Northern Virginia the resources were hard pressed just in general. The city was overcrowded. Places to live were hard to find. They were expensive. Transportation was always inconvenient. But for African Americans, it was even more so. They were not welcomed at the better places to find an apartment. In transportation, they had to ride segregated buses, that sort of thing. It was, and of course, many eateries would not serve them, or at least not serve them at the front door. So it was a really distressing time just in the environment in which they would work. But they were I expect overjoyed would not be too strong a word to say that they had gotten federal jobs. They had gotten jobs that had real meaning, real purpose. They were getting a fair income for the time, and it's a credit to all of them that they did their work, did it well, and remained true to their security oaths. The African American workers at Arlington Hall were segregated at Arlington Hall. It was, after all, a military institution. It was a pretty strong segregation. I talked to one white officer who had been assigned to Arlington Hall during the war, and the only African Americans he remembered seeing on the post were messengers and mess hall personnel. So the segregation must have been pretty strict. But some of the African Americans that we have talked to said that in addition to being in a separate building from the mainline or mainstream white workers, the African Americans generally kept to themselves. They would eat in their own offices rather than go to the dining facilities on Arlington Hall. And even though Arlington Hall had a kind of a rich social life during the war, generally speaking, the African Americans did not participate in this. I should say that Bill Coffey was made the supervisor of this all African American office. He was the day-to-day manager of their operations. True to the times, a white officer had to countersign his reports, but I don't have the full knowledge or data to prove it, but he was one of the first professional supervisors in the federal government who was African American, and he may well have been the first professional supervisor who was African American. What did this office do? Well, the currency of intelligence, of course, is information, producing information, and in this case, useful to the war effort. We already mentioned that the previously existing workforce worked against enemy military communications, but there were many other potential targets for intercept and cryptanalysis that had important information, although not necessarily combat-related information. There was a vigorous international trade going on between the Axis nations, that is, Germany, Italy, and Japan, and the so-called neutral nations, many of them in South America, but also a few other places around the globe. The Allies, the United States and Britain primarily, by 1944, were winning the war in the air and the war at sea, and it became quite difficult for the Axis nations to get certain key materials that they could not procure in their occupied territory in Europe, or they could not get these materials in quantity. Fuel was one of these. Medicines was an important commodity that was in short supply in Nazi-occupied Europe. Certain kinds of food, and certainly foreign exchange to be used in further international trade was an important commodity also. So the communications of these neutral nations in their dealings with the Germans or the Japanese or the Italians had an importance, just had not had high enough importance because it did not bear on actual combat operations. Now, let me digress here a minute. There is a purpose to this, but it may seem a little scattershot at first. International communication was by Morse code. Often on the telegraph, there were extensive international telegraph networks, even in wartime, or using the Morse code over radio. And this was pretty extensive by the 1940s, was used by countries and by international businesses. When a business would communicate on the telegraph or even by radio, it was first an expensive process if it was by telegraph. And if it was by radio, it was a non-secure process. We all know that we use encryption on our computers and on our cell phones sometimes because we know sometimes people are eavesdropping. Well, in those days, of course, everybody knew that many countries around the world, not just the United States, were eavesdropping on their communications. And in the case of business concerns, sometimes rival companies would engage in industrial espionage by getting copies of their rival companies' communications. So businesses would protect their information and would look for cheaper ways of communicating in Morse code. Ever since the invention of the telegraph and Morse code, there was a booming business in commercial codes. These were books such as the one that you see here that allowed the use of a code on in Morse code. A commercial code book was like a dictionary, except that instead of a definition for each word, there would be a substitute word. And the substitute word could substitute for a single letter, the syllable of a word, the word itself, a whole phrase, or even a whole sentence. Theoretically, one word in this commercial code book could even represent a whole paragraph if that was desired. So there was a big business in commercial code books. And because these code books were available on the open market, there were businesses that sold the code books themselves. Companies that used commercial code books would take additional steps. If they had a word that they were sending in a message, they would find a way to scramble it, substitute for it, or whatever. And they would treat it like a traditional code, just in a government code or such thing. So theoretically, you could take a sentence like ship 10 tons of liver paste and in a code book, using a code book, reduce it to essentially 2 words. And you could do the same thing with a sentence or a paragraph of any length. You can see how it would save money on the telegraph, but also it may provide a measure of security. I should say, as an aside, liver paste was one of the precious commodities of World War II that the Germans were very anxious to get their hands on, and the Allies were anxious to stop them from getting it. Liver paste was an important ingredient in the diet of men who served on submarines and never got exposure to sunlight. So it was something that greatly affected the health or non-health of submariners. So the All African American Office worked against these commercial codes. It doesn't sound terribly exciting to have this kind of job, but the information really was important. First of all, it identified companies and countries that were doing business with Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan, allowing the State Department to try to get the government involved to stop this trade. If the trade could not be stopped officially, then this information could be used to stop a ship at sea and search it for contraband goods. And this information was also very valuable in analyses of the enemy's economy and social situation. If we knew what the enemy needed to buy, what he was willing to pay for it, a want list, a shopping list, if you will, it told our analysts a lot about the state of the economy and perhaps the society of the enemy country involved. So this went on throughout the war and was an understated but still valuable contribution to winning World War II. At the end of the war, Arlington Hall downsized severely for the first year or so. Most workers, both white and African American, departed, but the United States did not get a peaceful post-war world as we expected. Very soon we were in a rivalry with the Soviet Union we called the Cold War, and many of these people were called back to duty or were asked if they would like to come back, and many did. This included many of the African Americans. Now, their contribution was recognized, but they were still living in a racist society. Despite the contribution both in combat and civilian life of African Americans during the war, segregation and discrimination continued. And I should say, we've been talking strictly about an Army organization up till now, but shortly after the war, the Army and Navy cryptologic organizations or signals intelligence organizations were consolidated into the National Security Agency. And as it happened, the customs of the war continued in cryptologic service as well. While segregation was no longer an official policy, it became an unofficial practice. A very large number of African Americans who came back or were newly hired after the war were sent into menial jobs, working machines and things like that, rather than the cryptanalysis that they had done during the war. No official policy, but it was no surprise how many African Americans got sent down to what was known as the hole. Some exceptions. One was a lady named Minnie Kenny. She reported in as a recruit in 1951, just out of high school in Philadelphia, and found a fellow Philadelphian who was making assignments to jobs, and the person assigned her to a mainstream organization rather than going down into the hole. And she made a real success of her career. She was one of the sharpest people around. Carol Robinson, an electrical engineer, also entered the mainstream. People with special talents like engineers were generally accepted by their fellow engineers or other specialties, regardless of race. The segregation in society around Arlington Hall continued. I had a friend who had started at NSA in 1952. He reported for duty on his first day. He'd been staying with friends in Washington, D.C., got on the bus to Arlington Hall, and was shocked when the bus stopped at the Virginia state line and all African Americans had to walk to the back of the bus. It was a real lesson for a Northerner in what the realities of life were. But situation was changing. African Americans began moving into the mainstream. Raymond Weir sort of illustrates how it happened. He was hired in 1951 with a specialty. He was a polygraph operator. He'd give lie detector tests to prospective employees. They hired him in 1951. He joined a previously all-white organization, but he was the only African American there. And his only job was to give lie detector tests to African American employment recruits. But after a few years, as recruiting increased and as the existing workforce was tighter and tighter, he was allowed to give lie detector tests to white men. And by the 1960s, he was allowed to give the test to white women. So illustrates the kind of incremental progress that African Americans made at Arlington Hall and in the post-war employment. Three things helped change that situation. First of all, after the war, during the wartime, NSA or its predecessors took just about anybody that passed the aptitude tests. After the war, there was an increasing emphasis on hiring college graduates. This was no guarantee that somebody was not a bigot or was not discriminating in racial matters, but given the overall statistics, more people came in with open attitudes towards racial change. There were a number of white supervisors who sympathized with the African Americans who were being discriminated against. I know one person, a senior person who was Jewish, another who was sick and tired of Italian jokes about his heritage. They began to recognize that African Americans were not entering the mainstream in the way they should. And they took pains to hire African Americans whenever the opportunity presented itself. And they saw that African Americans got the key to advancement at NSA because of the technical work that's done. Generally, getting ahead means one has taken a lot of extra education in our professional specialties. And these supervisors saw that African American employees moving into the mainstream got opportunities for education, which then opened opportunities for advancement within the workforce itself. And third, with the civil rights movement, certainly it touched the conscience of many at NSA, including those who could make things happen. The NSA also established the Office of Equal Employment to hear complaints, to try to adjudicate various kinds of problem areas, and to see that all races and both genders got fair treatment in both job assignments and promotion opportunities. One of the chiefs of the equal employment opportunity who really made a difference was Minnie Kenny, a young high school graduate who had come in 1951 and had been purposely put into the mainstream. Minnie was one of my mentors at NSA, and I'm here to testify that she was a force of nature. She always had ideas, she was always active, and she did not shrink back from speaking her mind about discrimination, going straight to the three-star general in charge of NSA if that were necessary. So there were some really dynamic people who were pushing for beneficial change in the racial situation. So, are we now in some sort of paradise? Well, clearly not. But bigots are not hard to find in our society, and certainly not hard to find in the federal workforce, and not hard to find at NSA either. But there are now safeguards against them, and when there are acts of discrimination, they are often just personal. It's not an institutional practice these days. If you would like to know more about the original All African American Office, we have a publication of this at NSA. My office, the Center for Cryptologic History, has issued this. The only graphic I have at the moment is of our first edition. We've just issued a second edition with many more illustrations of photographs and so on. And we also have a series of what we call crypto comics, stories about cryptology and NSA, aimed at those who like graphic novels or newspaper comics, that sort of thing. Now, both these publications, as well as many more general publications, are available in two ways. They are available on the NSA website at www.nsa.gov, or through that website, you can contact our office, the Center for Cryptologic History. If you want hard copy, we can send you hard copy in some numbers if you need them, as long as supplies last. So I encourage you to follow up with the publications. And certainly if you have a need for historical information, whether about African Americans or other subjects that deal with our past and NSA or cryptology, our office is ready and actually anxious to serve, not just willing, but we love to talk about these subjects or provide publications about them, so don't hesitate to contact us. So I would welcome your comments and questions. Please.
David, we do have a couple questions. Let me read them.
Yeah, please go ahead.
And I'm sure you can expand upon them. Some of them you touched on, but I think people wanted a little more. So this is very early in your presentation. Did the orders for hiring, this was back early in your presentation, coincide with orders where the Army was required to activate African-American units, such as the Tuskegee Airmen? Eleanor Roosevelt played a role, I hear, as well.
I have to give you an immediate and accurate answer on that. I don't know. We have not yet found in the archives the original order that came to Arlington Hall. We only have people talking about it in oral histories or referring to it in later documents. So it's been a little hard for us to trace the origins of it. I'm hoping that, in the history business, one of the great factors is serendipity. We open a file and find that somebody mislaid a document into the wrong file, and all of a sudden we have our questions answered. But so far that it hasn't happened in regard to this question. But if it ever happens, we'll certainly publicize it.
Okay, good. Here's another one you mentioned about pay differences. A questioner asked, were there pay disparities between white and black workers? I know you said, general numbers, but I don't know whether there's something more specific you can relate.
Well, generally, during the war itself, everybody was at a low pay scale. And I don't think there was any discrimination for African Americans. It was wartime. People were expected to make sacrifices in time and pay and so on. So I think everybody, including the 7,000 so-called code girls, all got minimal salaries. After the war, up through the 1950s, often African Americans were hired at the lower end of the pay scale. But they were still happy to come to NSA because, first of all, it was a federal job, but also our low end of the pay scale was a little higher than other federal institutions. We would hire people, including African Americans, at what the government calls a grade 3, maybe up to 5, for entry level work, and that included African Americans. But in many federal government offices, they would hire African Americans or even sometimes other applicants at the 1 to 2 grade level. So NSA was always just a little higher. It was still the low end of the pay scale, but it was a little better than other federal agencies. And it was a federal job, which eventually held out the hope and maybe even the expectation of advancement.
Okay, good. Also, about 2/3 of the way through your presentation, you talked about monitoring countries, and this questioner asked, what were the 24 countries whose communications were monitored? And I think this is related to the commercial cryptology.
Yeah. Well, there were a number of countries, such as the countries of South America, for example. Most of them, with I think the exception of Brazil, allowed German agents to operate within their borders, including German commercial agents. So the communications from South American, not necessarily the countries, although sometimes it might be, but the companies in these countries. Some of the countries in I guess Africa, there were a few companies that operated even in countries that had once been colonies of the Europeans that were now operating a little more independently because the European countries were occupied by the Germans. Other countries in the East Asia area that also were former colonies or colonies that were now only loosely supervised by the Europeans would also deal in any way they could make money with Japan or with Germany. And some of the areas in the Indian Ocean that were able to operate independently because of the rather loose controls of the time would be included in that. If you get our publication, I think there's a comprehensive list in the publication, but in general, those are the countries, the companies in those countries, and sometimes the countries that we monitored and that the African American office worked against.
Okay, good. Where were these employees, the African Americans housed? You know, for the Pentagon, they built all of these government housing areas Shirley Holmes and others that were around, and they were segregated. Where were these people housed?
Well, all over Arlington, essentially, and maybe some in D.C. There was no official residence for the workers at Arlington Hall. They were all considered independent civilians hired by the government. They had to find their own accommodations at whatever cost it took, and however they could get transportation to Arlington Hall from their residence. Housing was tight all over the Washington, Virginia, Maryland area, and I don't have absolute specifics on the African Americans, but I'm given to understand that they would room with people they knew or people who ran boarding houses or rented out a spare room in the segregated African areas of D.C. and Northern Virginia. That was the way the white workers found their accommodations, and the African Americans did the same, but it was confined to the segregated areas of living quarters in those districts.
Okay. Here's some that get to be even more topical for now. What was the relationship between AHS and Vint Hall Station? Vint Hill Station, I should say.
Yeah, Vint Hill Station was the place that I mentioned earlier. I mentioned that the Army's cryptologic organization would travel, some of its people would travel between the Army headquarters building and a station in Warrenton, Virginia. That was a place called Vint Hill Farms. Vint Hill Farms was a station nestled in the Blue Ridge Mountains. Because it had the mountains behind it, it was a wonderful place to eavesdrop on communications from Europe. The signals would hit the mountains and bounce back down. Good hearability. So Vint Hill provided the raw material. There'd be intercept operators there who would be listening to enemy communications or the communications of these neutral nations, and they would copy them down, and the copy would be sent to Arlington Hall Station for whichever appropriate office needed to work it.
Okay.
So it was a feeder. It was a feeder of raw material to the analysts and translators at Arlington Hall Station.
Okay, good. Thank you. And then there's one last question we have. When did NSA clear out of Arlington Hall, and what was the building used for before the State Department turned it into a training facility?
Okay. There was a feeling after the war that the cryptologic work was too fragmented. The Army and the Navy had had separate efforts during the war itself. After the war ended, the Air Force established a similar signal intelligence organization to support its air operations. So this was expensive to maintain the hierarchy for three such organizations, and the movement became to consolidate them. This resulted in the formation of the National Security Agency in 1952, and its operations were split largely between Arlington Hall and an equivalent naval station in the center of the District of Columbia. So the idea was to find a place where the whole operation could be put in one place, and you get an economy of scale, and maybe they didn't have the word in those days, but synergism. So they looked around. They decided they had the perfect place, Fort Knox, Kentucky, until they surveyed the workforce and found that virtually every civilian was going to resign if they moved to Kentucky. Don't get your back up if you're from Kentucky. I like the place. But in those days, people didn't want to leave the cosmopolitan Washington area for what they thought was the backwoods. So they recalculated what they needed to in terms of requirements for accommodations and so on, work accommodations, and found Fort Meade, Maryland was the best next choice. So starting about 1955, Arlington Hall began sending some of its workforce to Fort Meade, Maryland, and it moved in stages from about 1955, 56 to about 1958. After all the NSA people were out of Arlington Hall Station, it became the operating headquarters for sort of a mini NSA. Even though there was a central organization, NSA, each of the services was allowed to keep a much smaller organization to do cryptanalysis specific to that service. Sometimes they had special needs, and Arlington Hall became the headquarters for the Army's cryptologic organization, known as the Army Security Agency, and that continued until Arlington Hall was turned over to the State Department.
Okay, one of the participants made a comment. There is an interesting Cold War museum out at Vint Hill Farms.
Yes, it's very good. Yeah. I visited it a couple times, spoken there a couple times. Several of my colleagues have also. And yeah, we think it's a very fine institution. I'm not allowed to endorse anything, so don't run right out and get yourself a ticket, but I might say so. But it's certainly worth looking into if you're interested in the subject.
Good. Well, thank you, David. And David Pearson, do you have any final words as the president to mention at the end here?
I don't. I just thank you for this presentation, and I'm sure that everybody that's online has gotten a lot from it. And thank you for sharing the further resources that are out there available on the subject.
Well, you're quite welcome, and I certainly encourage people to visit our website or contact us if you have an interest in or a need for this kind of information.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for enjoying this great presentation tonight. And I will close the meeting out here shortly. We don't even have to get up and leave the auditorium. We can just evaporate into cyberspace here. So, okay. Thank you, David.
You're welcome, and a good evening to everybody.